well, hello everyone. My name is Lucas Kaczynski. I am a tour guide and steward here at Pitcher's Mill, Grist Mill Museum in Maine, New York. We're operated by the Nanticoke Valley Historical Society, and we're a very unique slice of American agricultural and business history. You just don't see a mill like this very often anymore. Now, when I give folks tours of the mill, I like to start off with a little basic history of the mill. The mill was built in 1830 by brothers Daniel and Belton Slauson, and they built the original center of the mill, and it grew outwards over the years. Subsequent mill owners would add additions to it, as business grew, and there was the need for further storage and also manufacturing space. At one time, there was a large addition on the north side of the mill that was torn off. Again, as business decreased, subsequent additions were taken off. The mill got its name from Archie Pitcher, who owned the mill in the 1920s to the 1940s. And he had a whole business here. Across the street, he had a John Deere tractor dealership. He also sold hardware, cinder blocks, fence posts, really any sort of farm goods you might need in that period. The final owners of the mill were the Lanehart family, John and Elsie Lanehart, and they operated the mill into the mid to late 1950s. They finally closed the mill, and it was abandoned for approximately 30 years. In the 1990s, the Nanticoke Valley Historical Society was gifted the property from the Bowers Foundation, and over a 20-year period, it has been restored to how it would have looked in the 1800s to the early 1900s. Probably the most remarkable thing about this mill is it's really a snapshot in time. So many of the pieces of equipment, the advertising, it's all still here. It was never tampered with. It was never removed. It's left just as the miller did when he locked the doors in 1955. Now, this room right here is the mill office, all right? This is where mill business would have been conducted. Customers would have come in to settle up their accounts or to place orders. And really, this was almost a social hall for the community, as any general store or hardware store of the period would have been. We have here the great big cast iron parlor stove. Everyone would have gathered around here in the wintertime to keep warm, to play checkers, to talk business, politics, community gossip. This was just the central hub of the community for farmers and people to gather while they were waiting for things to be milled outside. One of the special artifacts in here that I like to tell folks about are these copper printing plates. These were used to manufacture the boxes that the flour would have been sold in, probably in the 1930s or 40s. So these would have come from a local print shop, probably in Endicott or Johnson City, and these would have physically printed the cardboard boxes. It's a reverse image of the Pitcher's Mill Sunrise Pancake Flour logo, and the boxes then would have been sold in stores. But previous to them selling the flour in boxes, flour would have been sold in bulk paper sacks such as this. Pitcher's Mill had several different designs of these bags, and they came in multiple sizes. This is the 5-pound size, and right here, for the busy housewife with a week of cooking, is a 25-pound size. And these would have been kept in the store, and the store clerk would have had a barrel or a bag of bulk flour, and he would have scooped out the appropriate amount for you right at the store. And so again, this was the logo developed by Archie Pitcher in the 1920s for Sunrise Pancake and Biscuit Flour. This is a very rare sack. Well, the 5-pounders, at one time across the street in the basement of the former John Deere dealership, there were thousands of these. Rumor has it a local hardware store, after Pitcher's Mill closed, acquired all the sacks and sold nails in them. So you'll see these from time to time, but these were, for the most part, new old stock unused. If we come over here, we see some of the original receipts from Pitcher's Mill. And right there is evidence of him being a John Deere dealer in the 1940s. And so every customer would have received a copy of this receipt with their complete order as to what they purchased or what they sold the mill possibly, as far as grain products and that sort of thing. One of the other artifacts that I like to show individuals, we found this in a box of receipts from the mill. This is the original account book from the 1940s, 1950s that the mill would have kept for all outgoing payments. All right, and it's all signed out by E.L., that's Elsie Lanehart. So while John was operating the mill, Elsie was managing the account books. And so any money that the mill paid out to other businesses, they bought quite a few products from Casco Mills in Waverly, dog food and that sort of thing, that they couldn't manufacture here. All outgoing payments were recorded in this book and signed out by Elsie. And any money that came into the mill was deposited in the Endicott Trust Company down on Washington Avenue. They had an account there. And of course, on the wall of the mill, we have different pieces of advertising from that period. These are original Pitcher's Mills calendars from the 1940s. These would have been given away to customers, generally at Christmas or New Year's. You would have received a copy for the coming year. And we've just tried to recreate this office as it would have looked probably in the 1930s and 40s, with that general store atmosphere of the original advertising and the the product sale of the sales pieces that would have been here in those years. And if we notice here on the wall, here is a map of the mill as it would have appeared probably in 1837, the 1830s and the 1840s. This is a copy of an original that we have in our archives. And if you notice, it pictures the Nanticoke Creek as well as the main road, approximately where Route 26 is today. But if you notice, it also labels the mill race as it would have been cut from the creek to go under the mill and deliver water right to the mill wheel to turn all the pieces of the process and grind grain into flour. That would have been completed by the original Slauson brothers as they were designing and placing the mill in the 1830s. Also in the office, we have these 3 license plates up here on the wall. Now, in the days of the horse and buggy, the horses and the wagons would come up in front of the mill and receive products to go out to the stores. But beginning in the 1920s, Pitcher's Mill used Chevrolet trucks to actually take the flour out to the stores and distribute it. These are the original license plates from different years, different models of Chevy trucks that they operated here at the mill. Actually, that commercial 1935 plate was found actually up under the floorboards, and it was unrolled and repainted. But all those would have been on trucks that operated here at the mill. And connecting to that, here in the receipt book is actually a receipt made out to Ben Hansen Chevrolet. They were a Chevy dealer down in Endicott for a new motor for one of the trucks that was here at the mill. For $149, you could buy a brand new Chevrolet motor in the late 1940s. And I'd also like to mention, in 1999, the mill here received a PAST award. So this is the Preservation Association of the Southern Tier, and they give out awards for certain buildings that have been restored particularly well and tell an important part of their community story. So in 1999, shortly after the mill was finally restored, we received this award as commemoration for the job that Tom Katasic and his team did in bringing the mill back to life and displaying it for the public. Alrighty. Well, the first thing that anyone would have seen entering the mill here was the scale. This was the first piece of equipment that would have been used in the milling process. If a farmer brought in their grain to be ground into flour, it first would have been weighed in here at the scale. Or if certain things were sold out of the mill, it would have been weighed here as well. This was an important piece of commercial equipment for Archie Pitcher or any other miller operating the property. So this square here that you see on the floor is actually the scale base itself. Underneath the floor are the weights and measures that connect to the scale, and the miller would have adjusted based on how much was being weighed here. And actually, whenever we have class tours in here, we'll weigh the whole class on the scale. And even though it hasn't been registered since the mid-1950s, it's still fairly accurate. Now this great big machine right here is a mixer. All right, this would have been used for mixing animal feed generally with molasses, minerals, anything they wanted to add to supplement the feed. Now the mill converted to electricity in the early 1940s. It was more efficient. It operated the equipment better than the old-time water power. And so this is an electrically powered mixer from probably the 1930s, early 1940s when they would have installed it. And so the feed goes inside here, and there's actually a little glass window that the miller can view inside. And it's essentially a great big blender. And so it'll mix together the feed with anything that they want to add to it as far as milk or any other supplements. And then it's bagged right down here, and it's operated by an electric motor up above. Now, originally, years and years before, in the pioneering days of the town of Maine and the early years of this mill, it was all operated by water power. As with any mill, all across the country. All these mills were built by a little stream, and then from the stream, a mill race would be cut. It would be a trench that would go underneath or next to the mill and operate a water wheel to turn all of the machinery. Now, the heart and soul of this mill, outside of the water wheel, is this great big steel shaft right here. This shaft powers everything within the mill. The water wheel connects to this shaft down beneath the floorboards, and so as this turns, it operates all the gears and the belts and the pulleys to turn every piece of machinery in the complex. Now, if you notice right here on this gear, it has wooden teeth. They did that for several reasons. First of all, if one tooth broke, you could simply replace the one tooth versus the entire gear. All right, it made repairs and upkeep quite a bit simpler. And also, metal-on-metal gears have the tendency to create sparks. And in a mill such as this, where there's constantly chaff and dust flying around and sedentary flammable material, you certainly don't want sparks to burn down the mill. So this was not only easier to upkeep, it was safer as well. And so these connect into other gears that connect the belts that operate all of the machinery. So the first machines that the grain would have come to on its journey to become flour are these dehulling machines right here. Now, grain has a protective covering around the outside called the hull. That's exactly how it grows on the stalk, but we need to get that off in order to turn it into high-quality flour. So the grain would have been poured into the hoppers up here on these dehulling machines, and it flows down through the machine through a series of sieves and shifts. All right, now this belt that's connecting back to the great big shaft is turning all of these sieves and knocking the hulls off of the grain. These hulls will then fall out down through this tube over the moving water downstairs. Those hulls are then whisked away downstream. It's free garbage disposal for the mill owners. As a matter of fact, we've heard stories that the miller would occasionally have to send people down the Nanticoke Creek to actually knock apart great big piles of these hulls that would develop downstream. But so as the hulls were dropped out over the water and taken away, the clean grain will move on to the next step of the process. Now, all of the grain moves throughout this mill through a series of these belts and tin cups. Just about every one of these wooden tubes that you see are hollow and contain these belt systems that take the grain from one machine to the next and one process to the next. And these always come in pairs, one going up, one going down. And these will connect in a central hub upstairs that connects back to the steel shaft here. So again, that water wheel downstairs is driving every piece of equipment, including these belts. So these two tubes right here will have a shaft running from them that goes back to the main one. And these will drop the grain off at different pieces of equipment for cleaning processes. So after the grain moves from the dehulling machines, it goes upstairs through the tubes to another cleaning machine. And then it's time to be ground into flour. Now, at one time, the mill would have been operating 3 millstones. One far set on the other side of the room, of which we still see the original millstone on the bottom. One set in the middle here, which has been physically boarded up when they put a new milling machine in. And this set right here, this is the final complete original set that we have. Now, millstones are absolutely remarkable. They've existed since ancient times, and really the whole premise and the production of them is not all that different from ancient Mesopotamia all the way to the 1800s in the town of Maine. And essentially, how a millstone works is there's 2 stones right here. This is a nifty little diagram that we had created several years ago. There is a bedstone, and the bedstone stays stationary. All right, it doesn't move. But the runner stone on top is the one moving and doing the grinding. And this runner stone is connected down to a belt pulley. All right, and this pulley exists directly beneath the floor here and connects back to the water wheel via a belt. So the grain, it would have come down through this chute right here, down between the stones. Now, if we can notice back there, there's a great big wooden hopper that we have sitting on the floor. That's just sitting there for display purposes. During actual productions, this metal arm would have been swung out of the way, and that wooden hopper would have been sitting on top of the stones to collect the grain. the grain will then come down through this tube into the hopper. And this little wooden piece right here is called the chute. This is essentially a funnel that takes the grain from the hopper down into the stones. And so this is going to be shaking, funneling the grain down through to be ground. And so there is a ever so slight distance between the bed stone and the runner stone that actually allows the grain to be ground without wearing the stones too much. That grain will then be, or the flour as it's ground, will be filtered to the outside of the stones and collected down beneath here in a basin. It then goes up a couple more tubes to be cleaned upstairs before finally being ready to be sold in the stores. Now what we're seeing right here on top is a plaster cap. All right, the reason this plaster cap is here is so that this metal arm can be attached to it, and it can be jacked up on this screw and tilted on its side so that the grooves of the stones can be re-chiseled if necessary. As a matter of fact, the miller, he had this fellow from Cincinnati, New York. He would come down in a Model T Ford. All the way into the 1950s, he was still operating an antique car like that. And he was a stonemason. And so he would come down and he would dress the stones. He would re-chisel the grooves to make them sharp again. He would stay the night in the miller's house. The next morning he would finish the job and go home to Cincinnati. Now, the old expression, keep your nose to the grindstone. Well, the miller physically had to have his nose close to the stone and listening to how they operated in order to tell if they were becoming dull or not. The miller could tell by the sound they were making if they were dull and needed to be dressed again. Now, to give perspective on what one of these stones looks like, this is the bed stone for the third set that we have here. Most of these stones weigh 1 to 2 tons apiece. And most of them are made from granite, imported from Nova Scotia, France, some of the best granite mines in the world. And there were stonemasons whose specific job was to craft millstones. Because, of course, the more effective the design of the grooves, the better it's going to grind and the more stones are going to sell. So this was a highly specialized craft. And consequently, some of these stonemasons even patented their designs as to how the grooves ran. And if you notice the grooves, they all run to the outside. So as the grain is falling down upon them and that runner stone is turning, it's going to grind that grain into flour and filter it to the outside where it drops down into a basin and it's ready for cooking. Now, beginning in the 1940s, the mill converted to electric over water power. It was simply more efficient. It was the way of modern milling. So what they did is they installed this electric box right here. And so the miller, as he stood here, he would have taken this lever, he would have pulled it into start, and then thrust it into run. And this whole mill would have come alive. It would have physically shaken with the power of the stones moving. All right, but this is taking away the old millstones and converting it to an electric-powered stone right here. So this electric box would be running a motor sitting on this platform, which ran a belt back to those pulleys, and then a belt forward to here again. And so as this is spinning, these become the new millstones. So the grain would have been filtered down through this tube into the hopper and been ground between those two stones. Now, I say stones in the respect that they serve the same purpose as the great big granite ones, but these are made of steel. And if you notice, on each of these steel discs are mounted these smaller steel plates, of which we have an example there on the floor. They come in sections so that if one breaks, they can simply be replaced. And we still have boxes of new old stock sections of the plates that were simply never used by the miller. Now, flour comes in different coarsity. Coarser flour is bread flour. Finer flour is cake and pastry mix. And so to adjust exactly how coarse you were grinding the flour, the miller would have used this lever right here. And so if you notice on these stones, as the miller pushes the lever that way, it brings the stones closer together and makes for finer flour. As he draws it apart, coarser flour can be made. And so this was the machine they would have been milling on in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. All right. right, well, this machine here is called a bagging press. This would have been the final machine in the entire milling process as the flour was completely refined and it was ready to be sent out to the stores or the homes that would use it. So as I explained earlier, the flour will be taken up a couple of those chutes from the millstones upstairs to a cleaning machine, as you'll see later in the video. It will then drop down through this hopper into this press. And again, this is all operated by the water power downstairs. If you notice this great big pulley right here, this is operated by this belt that connects back to the main shaft. So as this turns, it turns these gears and turns an auger inside there that's going to bring the flour down from the hopper into the barrel, or this is called a sack packer because instead of a barrel, you can tie off a sack around there, 50 or 100 pounds or 150 pounds, and it'll be filled up with the flour. Now the marvelous thing about this machine is there's an adjustment that can be made to it. If the miller puts down this handle, it sets the machine so that as this is filling up with flour, it automatically shuts it off. It disengages these gears. All right, this engages the gears, it brings them together. And so as this is falling, it disengages the gears and automatically shuts it off. All right, this display right here is a collection of different advertising feed bags that would have been used from the late 1800s all the way into the 1940s and 50s. All right, and in the early years, the feed bags were very, very plain because it was simply a local mill selling to local people. There wasn't a need to put a whole lot of advertising into it. Everybody knew the miller, everybody knew the product that he made. But as we get into the 1920s and 30s, and many of these mills started getting very big and started going regional, that's when they started getting the better graphics and the colors and the images to help sell the product. Elmore Feeds was out of Oneonta, Stanford's was out of Binghamton, Park and Pollard was from Boston and Buffalo. So many of these feed bags became almost like artwork in an attempt to sell the product. This here is a particularly fascinating piece of artwork. This is an advertisement for McCormick Deering farm equipment, specifically McCormick reapers that would have been used to harvest the wheat in the fields. We found this discovered under the seat of a wagon that we were restoring in the wagon shops that we also own. And it was all folded up under the seat, presumably used as stuffing for the seat cushions. But originally, this would have been a poster in a McCormick Deering farm equipment dealership around the turn of the century, 1895-1900. And it would have been a large wooden frame around it with an advertising placard talking about the McCormick brand. But if you look at the imagery, this is really about the Spanish-American War and someone coming home from the war at the turn of the century to the family farm. One of the other pieces that we have on this wall that's original to the mill, and it really speaks something of the firefighting technology of the period, is this fire grenade right here. That's what collectors and enthusiasts call them because you throw it like a grenade at the fire. It's made of glass and filled with a chemical called carbon tetrachloride. As you throw it at the fire, the glass breaks, and that chemical takes the oxygen out of the fire. Unfortunately, it's an exceptionally deadly, toxic, carcinogenic chemical. It's been outlawed for about 50 years, and so consequently those have been as well. But there was a time that fire grenades were in just about every business, institution, or factory in America. It was a popular form of firefighting technology. It was a fire extinguisher at its day because it was quick, effective, and right on the wall when you needed it. And it was especially important in a mill such as this with so much flammable material to have firefighting apparatus right at hand. The signs on the wall here are original to the 1930s and 1940s. These would have been on the outside of the building so that motorists coming up and down the road would have seen the different brands of feed that the mill here offered. Now, neither of these were milled here exclusively at the mill, but they were rather national brands that were sold here locally. Casco was a regional brand out of Waverly, sold by many of the mills, hardware stores, and farm supply companies in the area. Worthmore was exclusive to the Northeast here, especially in Old New England and also the Mid-Atlantic. And you can see that they offered poultry, dairy, and stock feeds. And so these offered a more diverse range of products that customers could buy here that were not milled exclusively at Pitcher's Mill. Now this room here was an addition that was put onto the mill sometime around 1900, 1910. And this really would have been a storage facility as well as some additional manufacturing space. This here is an additional bagger similar to the one that we saw in the other room. Although this one, there's no automatic stop on it. It's a little cruder and more primitive, albeit it was installed later than the other one. This one is simply the bag is to be put on it, and it's to fill it with flour. This would have been used once they started using the electric millstones, and the water-powered sack packer that you saw in the other room was decommissioned. Now this room right here is home to a lot of different agricultural implements and early pieces of farming technology that we have in the collection. These are particularly interesting. They're called fanning mills. These would have been physically used on the farm. Most of these pieces are not from a mill, but they speak to the history of farming in that time period and how grain would have come to the mill in the first place. So the grain would have been put in the top of either one of these fanning mills, and inside is a great big wooden fan, hence the name. And so the farmer, as he turned this wooden crank, it turns that fan around, and it's going to knock out any sort of dust, chaff, weeds, dirt, anything impure that came in with the grain from the field. It's going to blow that out, and the clean grain is going to deposit in this drawer down beneath that the farmer can then bag up and bring to a mill like this to be ground into flour. One of the other interesting things we have here is this vintage bell post. All right, this probably dates to the 19th century or so, and what's remarkable about this is that they took a limb off of a tree, the complete limb, and just took off the branches and sanded it down and then painted it this oxblood red. And you can see up there, there is the crook that the bell sits in. All right, and this could have been a church bell, possibly a dinner bell or a school bell. It would have been set outside someplace in a public place where people could hear it. This here is a bean cleaner. All right, this would have been used for beans or peas or small things like that. They would have been deposited in the hopper up top, and this one is actually foot treadle operated, very similar to a sewing machine. So whoever would have been operating this on the farm would have been pressing this with their foot, and it turns that belt, and it turns the sifters, and it essentially knocks off all of the dirt from the peas or beans or whatever you're putting in there, and it brings them out onto this belt that you can then push off into a bucket on the side. All of these are cleaning equipment for the farmer to get the product as clean as it can be before it's either stored for consumption or brought to a mill like this. Some of the other pieces that we have are this early cider press here. Now, cider was exceptionally important in this region. We grow a lot of apples here, and so they would have put the apples right down here in this cage, and this steel plate presses them down and squeezes the juice out to where they can be fermented and stored for the wintertime. These machines right here are called silage cutters. These would have been used on the farm to make silage for the cattle. So what they would have done with these is there's a series of knives inside here that as you turn this crank, it turns the wheel here, and it's going to cut up the stalks as you're pushing them through the chute, and it cuts them up for silage so that the cattle have food for the winter. And many of these had a very elaborate stenciling and really beautiful colors painted on them, again, as a sales tool to attract people to buy them. Because at one time there were thousands of little manufacturers all across the country making similar pieces of farm equipment. From silage cutters to fanning mills to corn shellers, everybody had a different idea on how to produce one, an improvement that could be made. And so this stenciling and this advertising helped sell and promote the product. And some of the technological features that were included in this were often advertised on the side of them, new developments and features that were made. These are corn shellers. So these would have, again, been used on the farm. These are great big floor models, and this is a smaller tabletop model that could have been clamped to a table, and you would have fed the ears of corn into them. And so inside these floor models, you can see here on the tabletop model is the exposed steel wheel with these small pegs, and it's going to knock off the kernels of corn and essentially shell the cob for you. The bare cob comes out one side, the shelled kernels come out the other. And so these great big floor models would have been used generally in the barn for processing corn to to either bag up and bring to a mill like this or store for the winter time for animals, while a smaller tabletop one like this might have been used in a kitchen for more domestic purposes. And going into the first part of the 20th century, many farms began using hit-and-miss engines such as this. All right, it's called a hit-and-miss engine based on the way it operates. The cylinder accepts a piston, and that will hit, and then it will withdraw. It will miss, and then hit again, and by the popping sound, that's why some people call them hit-and-miss engines. These were generally operated off gasoline or kerosene, and the remarkable thing about these is that they have this belt pulley that you could then hook a leather belt up to, and you could run anything on a farm with it. A washing machine, a corn sheller, a windmill for pumping water. An entire farm could be run off of these for really very little money in operating costs. And so this brought mechanization to many farms that previous to that had only had horse or human power. This brought many farms into the modern age and was the precursor to the tractor for many farming families. All right, one of the other artifacts that we have here is this wooden rake wire bending apparatus. All right, so this would have been the form for actually bending the pieces of wire to support the head of the rake. This came from a local rake manufacturer right here in the town of Maine on Lewis Creek. They had a barn where they manufactured these wooden rakes with the wooden peg teeth. And so this would have been the handmade wooden form for them to bend the wire supports and begin to assemble the rakes by hand. This is a display of different feed bags that we have that have these really brilliant and colorful patterns on it. And these speak to a really impoverished time in American history. These all date from the Great Depression. All right, and of course, in that period, most families could barely make a living. Whether you were on the farm or in the city, everybody was struggling, and especially the American farmer. So what they ended up doing was starting to make clothing out of feed bags. Folks simply didn't have the money to afford store-bought clothing, so they would use any scrap of material that they could to create aprons and dresses, pants and shirts out of. And so the feed companies and the milling companies realized this. So many of them began printing these feed bags with these floral and colorful designs to help sell the product because they realized that people would make clothes out of them anyway. All right, and this is an example of different dresses, aprons, and pieces of clothing that were made during the 1930s out of these colorful feed sacks. Many people will hear stories from their grandparents about this time when folks had to be thrifty to survive. And that included making clothing out of utilitarian things like feed sacks. And even some of the advertising feed sacks, as we saw on the other wall, will actually have instructions printed on them as to how to wash out the ink to get a clean piece of fabric to work with. On the wall here we have a display of different farming implements, most of these 19th century or early 20th century in nature. And these are all, for the most part, handmade pieces, you know, and certainly pieces that would have been used by hand in the era before mechanized farming. This is an example of a grain cradle. Well, those are regular size without the cradle that would have been used for cutting grain right in the fields. And these are smaller hand size used by a fellow Warren McGregor right here in the town of Maine. Many of these have local stories to them and connect to local people. For example, this little sleigh right here was made by the McIntyre family. And that probably dates to the early 1900s and could have been a small sleigh taken into the woods to gather firewood or small things like that. This is a similar sleigh in that it's very utilitarian in nature, and it probably could have been used for hauling things around the farm during the wintertime through the snow. And here's some more examples of different rakes, some of them locally made, some of them more nationally made and more manufactured and machined, but especially this one with the wooden teeth. It's all hand-built. Somebody took the time to carve out these wooden rungs and bars for support, and the whole handle, the shaft is also handmade. So many of these were handcrafted by people who would then use them over the course of their lives. These are some photos that were taken to the mill during the whole restoration process in the early to mid-1990s. The restoration of the mill was spearheaded by local IBMer Tom Katasik, who he remembers coming to the mill as a little boy from the family farm up on Maine Lewis Road and bringing grain right here to the mill to be ground. These are photos of them recreating the sign that was originally on the side of the mill with the Sunrise Pancake Flour logo. At one time, that was physically painted on the side wall of the mill. And so what they did during restorations is cutting that section of the wall out, putting a new wall in, and then restoring the sign and placing it back on top. Here you can see what the sign looked like originally before restoration work began. It was very faded, and again, it was just part of the wall itself that they ended up cutting out, repairing the wall, and then restoring and placing the sign back on top. And that's what the mill looked like probably in the late 1980s or early 1990s before restoration began. All the doors and windows were gone for the most part, and many people who lived in town at the time can remember the large peace sign that was spray painted on the cupola up above. And so restoration work took 6 or 7 long years, but by the late 1990s it was finished, and now the community has a mill they can enjoy. So downstairs here in the basement of the mill is where the water wheel would have been, and it's truly the heart and soul of the mill. It's what would have operated all of the machinery that you've seen above, and this would have been the main source of power to keep the mill going for years and years. Now, to the back of the mill, we have the Nanticoke Creek, and from the Nanticoke Creek would have been cut a mill race, which is essentially a trench, and it would have been cut from the north side of the mill to a pond that would have formed just off of the north wall. This mill pond would have then fed water underneath here. Now, the mill wheel is sometimes called the breast wheel, and it would have sat approximately where that pipe is located. And as we can see by this diagram here, there would have been a wooden tube called the flume that would have fed the water down underneath the breast wheel and turned it. Now, this breast wheel in turn would have turned a belt on a great big wooden drum there. And running up through that wooden drum is a steel shaft that I've explained turns all the machinery in the building. So as that breast wheel turns, it turns that drum, and in turn, it operates the shaft that connects to all the machinery throughout the mill. Now, to either side of this drum, we can see up here are smaller wooden drums that connect to the base of the millstones. And as a matter of fact, you can still see the original leather belt as it connects from the base of this smaller drum back to the main drum. And so that's what's going to operate the millstones on either side of the floor above. Now, the mill wheel itself would have been taken out probably sometime in the 1930s when they converted to electric power over the water power. It was simply no longer needed. The mill race continued on its way out the other side of the mill and back to the Nanticoke Creek. You can still see a slight depression in the lawn as the mill race was filled in, and it would have continued on its way back to the creek. Now, the basement of the mill here is a wonderful example of the bare bones of the mill. It's physical construction. This is all hand-hewn red beech timber. You can just imagine the massive size of the trees needed to cut boards such as this. And it's all post and beam construction. A mill like this is all held together with post and beam pressure. There were no nails in the original framework itself. And if you notice, on either side of our mill race today, we have a couple of these steel grates. And originally, they would have had grates such as this in order to keep debris from washing down underneath the mill if, say, a storm came through and was blowing trees and limbs and other debris down the mill race and underneath. These grates protected the breast wheel and allowed the mill to remain clear down here of any debris. And here we can see the underneath of these belts as they connect from one shaft to the next. Originally, this would have all been enclosed with wood. That's since rotted off in subsequent years. But you can see how the belts that carry the grain from one step to the next and one machine to the next are all one continuous loop. And they meet in these bottom basins before being taken back upstairs. And actually, up here in the ceiling, we can see the base of the tubes that would have dropped the hulls out over the moving water and rushed them down the stream. Now, where we're standing right now wouldn't have existed originally. All right, this has simply been put here for the convenience of folks to come down here and see what the basement of the mill looks like. Originally, this was all open space with rushing water moving underneath. But consequently, since we're on the same level as the creek, whatever the Nanticoke Creek is doing, as far as water level is concerned, it's also going to be doing here in the basement of the mill. If we turn and look here, here's a sign that was put in the flood of 2011 that we had in September of 2011. And that water level, just approximately 2 feet below the floorboards of the first floor, that was the water level throughout the entire basement. And so every few years when we have a fairly significant flood, it'll get to approximately that level or so throughout the whole basement. Because again, we're completely dependent upon what the creek's doing behind the mill. If we look down here, right now we've had a fairly dry spell for a few days. There's not much water down there. Once we get some more rains, that water level will rise because this is all clay soil and we're right on the level of the creek water. All right, this is a collection of tools, different implements for woodworking, metalworking, blacksmith type work, and so many of these would have been owned by farmers simply because they had to repair all of their own implements and manufacture their own barns and sheds and homes. So most farmers maintained a collection of tools similar to this. From blacksmith anvils for hand forging all sorts of parts and pieces for tools, to grinding stones that were used for sharpening scythes and knives. These are sort of unique in the fact that they're foot treadle operated. So you pedal them almost like a bicycle. You can see they move up and down like that, so you sit on the seat and pedal it, and you can sharpen your knives right here on the stone. And this is a smaller example right here with a smaller stone for consequently smaller knives. And we have different pieces of woodworking equipment from drill presses to carpenter's boxes to the saws that would have been used to cut through the ice on rivers and lakes to get ice for the ice boxes in the summertime. So all of these were very common tools at one point because they were the tools that allowed people to make their living, and so consequently everybody had them. One of the more interesting stories here is this wooden head. It's carved out of a stump, and during the restoration process of the mill, Tom Katasa came in one morning in the early fall when it's often very misty. And as he pulled his truck up, he saw staring out of the mist that face sitting on top of a lumber pile. Well, a few days later, one of his helpers told him he carved it using a chainsaw, but we often like to say that the ghost of Archie Pitcher lives in the head. And, well, I haven't had any particular experiences myself. Some folks say they've heard footsteps late at night, if they've been here at the mill, walking along the course of the upstairs. It's for you to decide. Here on the second floor of the mill, we have some other manufacturing equipment that would have been used through the milling process. Most of these machines back here are cleaning machines. So once the grain had gone through the dehulling machines downstairs, they would have been brought up through some of the assorted tubes, as you saw down on the main floor, to these machines right here. And similar to the dehulling machines, these are mostly a series of different sieves that are just knocking the grain around and getting it clean. They will then send any of the debris down a great big pipe out and over the mill race to again be washed down the stream, and the clean grain will then move on to the millstones, or in the case of this machine right here, it bags it directly downstairs. These pipes will lead down to the main floor where the miller simply could have put a bag around them and bagged up the straight grain if it would have been rye, wheat, corn, something they might not have wanted to grind but possibly feed straight as cattle feed, or even for planting in the following spring. Probably the most significant piece of equipment up here is this flour sifter. So this would have been sifting all of the flour once it was ground from the millstones and before it was ready to be packed. So if you notice, there's these two great big tubes here that come up from the millstones, and it drops the flour inside of this great big cylinder here. All right, in this cylinder, it's going to be knocking the flour around, and again, this is all powered by the water downstairs. This shaft right here connects to another shaft, and it connects back to the main one that connects to the millstone. So as this cylinder is going to be turning, it's just knocking the flour around, getting it clean, sifting it, taking out any clumps, and it then deposits it down a chute here into the bagging press that we saw downstairs. So this is simply for cleaning the flour and getting it sifted and ready to be sold in the stores. And if we notice up here, there are further belts and pulleys that most of these would have been depositing grain in these wooden stalls that you see. The grain would have been taken up through those chutes and then blown out through that tube into a pile in the stalls to be milled at a later time or simply stored. And this cupola on top of the mill was built to accept this piece of equipment, which sticks up above the roof line. If you notice here in the floor, there are these smaller peg holes right here where studs would have come up, and these wooden stalls could have extended that much further for the sake of storing more grain. If we notice on this ladder right here, if you look at the rungs, look how worn down these are by years and years of feet climbing up here to service the equipment or close the window in the far back of the eaves. That's 2 centuries of walking up and down that ladder every day. People coming here their entire lives to go to work. That's representative of, several generations of work just in one ladder and the way that they wore down the rungs. And so if we notice, there's a door here in the upstairs. This is so that grain could have been taken in or sent out through a pulley system that was operated in the eaves there, and we can see the rope that is tied around that post. They would have dropped down a pulley, which would have been able to bring up any sort of grain that they wanted to take off of trucks or wagons that parked along the road, and that could have been brought up here and stored in these stalls. Or, to the same degree, if something needed to be sent down, it could have been dropped down through this door to a waiting vehicle underneath. One of the most unique attributes of the mill is that really in many respects it's frozen in time. So many of these things are left just as the miller had them 60, 80, 100, 150 years ago. All right, if we look at this post right here, that's decades worth of postings that were nailed to that post. Everything from workers' compensation notices to newspaper articles, the tags from feed sacks, just about anything that the miller wanted the employees or his customers to know about got put on these posts. And you can see just as many nails and nail holes from things that have been ripped off over the years. This was essentially the community bulletin board for anybody that came in here. And to the same degree, one of my favorite things in this mill is if we look here on this post, there's this lovely little clipping that's all motivational sayings from different household objects. Aspire to greater things, said the nutmeg. Never lose your head, said the barrel. And hanging on that same post is part of an Archie Pitcher's Mills yardstick that he would have given away. And even though it's half of it, it's been hanging there for probably the better part of 80 years. And these are the original pieces of twine that they would have used to tie off the bags of the flour, the paper bags of flour. They would have set some sort of a barrel or a table right here, and they would have maintained these for easy access to tie off the bags and send them to the stores. This is an original from Pitcher's Mill, and when the mill closed in the 1950s, a local individual acquired the stone and actually put the flagpole into it. And this was at his house. Well, when we began restoring the mill, we were able to track down that this stone was somewhere still here in the community and that a fella had made a flagpole out of it. Well, he said we could have the stone back, but we had to take the whole thing, flagpole and all. So that's why we have the flagpole outside of the mill here, is because it's still the original stone from this building. The mill, on this just wonderfully beautiful day, we can still see traces of the mill race, as it would have come from the mill and turned the water wheel and continued on its way back to the Nanticoke Creek. That large depression in the lawn is still evidence of the mill race, as it would have gone back to the river and continued on its way downstream.